The iron door slammed shut behind Julia Zimmerman with such force that the sound echoed through the mountain pass, and she stumbled forward into the blinding white expanse, wearing nothing but a thin cotton dress and stockings that were already soaked through from the snow that had begun falling that morning in Calico, California, in January of 1884. Her husband, the man she had trusted with her life and her father's fortune, had just thrown her out of their cabin with no shoes, no coat, and no mercy in his eyes when he told her he never wanted to see her face again after discovering she had helped his business rival escape town with information about his illegal mining operations. Julia's feet burned with cold as she took her first steps into the snow, the white powder rising past her ankles and seeping through her stockings within seconds. She could hear Thomas shouting from inside the cabin, his words slurred with whiskey, telling her she deserved to freeze for her betrayal. The wind whipped her dark hair across her face as she turned away from the only shelter for miles, knowing that going back would mean worse than the cold. Thomas had struck her before, but the rage in his eyes tonight had been different, murderous even, and she knew that if she pounded on that door begging for entry, he might just finish what the elements would start. The mountain path stretched before her, winding down toward the main road that led back to Calico, a good 5 miles away through increasingly rough terrain. Julia wrapped her arms around herself and began walking, each step sending shards of ice through her feet and up her legs. The thin dress provided almost no protection against the wind that cut through the fabric like it was nothing at all. She had been married to Thomas for only 8 months, having wed him at 21 after her father passed, and left her vulnerable to the smooth-talking businessman who had seemed so charming in the beginning. The reality of her situation had revealed itself slowly, like ice forming on a pond. First came the controlling behavior, then the drinking, then the realization that Thomas had married her for her inheritance and nothing more. When she discovered he was running an illegal operation that was cheating miners out of their rightful claims and putting lives at risk through unsafe practices, she had made the choice to help James Garrett, an honest prospector who had evidence of Thomas's crimes, get safely out of town with the documentation that could bring her husband to justice. She had not anticipated that Thomas would discover her involvement so quickly, or that his retaliation would be so swift and brutal. Julia's feet had gone from burning to numb by the time she had walked a quarter mile down the mountain path. The snow was falling more heavily now, fat flakes that stuck to her eyelashes and melted on her cheeks, mixing with the tears that she could not seem to stop. She tried to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, on the mechanics of survival rather than the hopelessness of her situation. The main road was still so far away, and even if she reached it, who would be traveling in weather like this? The temperature was dropping as evening approached, and Julia knew enough about the winters in these mountains to understand that she was in genuine danger of freezing to death before she found help. The path curved around a rocky outcropping, and Julia had to grab onto the stone face to keep from slipping on the ice that had formed beneath the snow. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely maintain her grip, and when she finally made it around the bend, she had to stop and lean against the rock face, gasping for breath. Her feet felt like blocks of ice attached to her legs, and she could no longer feel her toes at all. She knew this was a bad sign, knew that frostbite was setting in, but there was nothing she could do except keep moving and pray that somehow she would survive this night. The sound of horse hooves on the packed snow reached her ears, and Julia's heart leaped with hope. She pushed away from the rock and stumbled forward, trying to see through the curtain of falling snow to spot the rider. A dark shape emerged from the white, a man on horseback moving carefully along the treacherous path. Julia tried to call out, but her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, her throat tight with cold and emotion. She waved her arms instead, desperate to catch the rider's attention before he passed by without seeing her. The horse stopped abruptly, and the man dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the snow with a soft thud. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat and a hat pulled low against the wind. Julia could not see his face clearly through the snow, but she saw him start toward her with long, purposeful strides. She tried to take a step toward him, but her legs gave out, and she would have fallen face first into the snow if he had not caught her. Strong arms wrapped around her, and Julia found herself being lifted against a warm chest. She looked up into a face that was weathered by sun and wind, with sharp features and eyes the color of storm clouds. The man was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly beneath his hat, and a jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. His expression was one of shock and concern as he took in her condition, his eyes moving from her face to her soaked dress to her bare, bleeding feet. "Jesus Christ," he said, his voice rough with disbelief. "What happened to you?" Julia tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering so hard that she could not form words. The man did not wait for an answer. He turned and carried her back to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that stood patiently in the snow. Julia felt him shift her weight, adjusting his hold so he could reach for a blanket that was tied behind his saddle. He wrapped it around her quickly, tucking it tight around her body before lifting her again. "My name is Yates Morrison," he said, looking down at her with those intense gray eyes. "I am going to get you warm and safe, but I need to know if you can hold on to me if I put you on the horse." Julia managed to nod, though she was not certain she could do what he asked. Yates seemed to read the doubt in her eyes because he shook his head and made a decision. He lifted her higher against his chest, and then swung himself up into the saddle with impressive strength, settling her across his lap so she was cradled against him. He pulled the blanket tighter around her and then wrapped his coat around both of them, creating a cocoon of warmth that made Julia gasp with relief. "There is a way station about 2 miles from here," Yates said, his breath warm against her frozen ear. "We will get you there and get you warm." "Can you tell me your name, Julia?" she managed to whisper through her chattering teeth. "Julia Zimmerman." She felt Yates stiffen at the surname, and she knew he had made the connection. Everyone in the region knew Thomas Zimmerman, the wealthy businessman who controlled much of the mining operations around Calico. Julia waited for Yates to put her down, to decide that helping the wife of such a powerful man was more trouble than it was worth, but instead, he just urged his horse forward at a careful pace, keeping one arm wrapped firmly around her to hold her steady. "Hold on to me," Yates said quietly. "We will get you through this." Julia turned her face into his chest, breathing in the scent of leather and horse and something distinctly masculine. She could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, strong and reassuring. Her own heart was racing with cold and fear and relief, and she found herself gripping the front of his shirt beneath the coat, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world that had turned treacherous and uncertain. The ride to the way station felt like it took both forever and no time at all. Julia drifted in and out of awareness, the cold having sapped so much of her strength that she could barely keep her eyes open. She was vaguely aware of Yates talking to her, his voice steady and calm as he told her to stay awake, to keep fighting. She tried to focus on his words, on the warmth of his body against hers, on anything except the pain that was beginning to return to her feet as they started to thaw slightly in the relative warmth of the blanket and coat. The way station appeared through the snow like a mirage, a small wooden structure with smoke rising from its chimney. Yates brought his horse right up to the door and dismounted carefully, keeping Julia secure in his arms. He kicked at the door with his boot, and after a moment, it swung open to reveal an elderly man with a wild gray beard and suspicious eyes. "Needs shelter," Yates said firmly. "The lady is suffering from exposure. She needs warmth and medical attention immediately." The old man's eyes widened as he took in Julia's condition, and he stepped back immediately, gesturing them inside. The interior of the way station was blessedly warm, heated by a large iron stove in the center of the room. There were several chairs and a table, along with a narrow bed in one corner that looked like it had seen better days but was covered in clean blankets. "Put her by the stove," the old man said, moving quickly despite his age to drag one of the chairs closer to the heat source. "I will get more blankets and hot water." Yates set Julia down gently in the chair, keeping the blanket wrapped around her as he knelt in front of her. His face was serious as he looked up at her, his hands moving to carefully unwrap the blanket from around her feet so he could assess the damage. Julia looked down and had to suppress a cry at the sight of her feet. They were white and red in patches, with spots of black on her toes that she knew meant the frostbite was worse than she had hoped. "This is going to hurt," Yates said softly, his gray eyes meeting hers with sympathy. "When your feet warm up, the pain is going to be intense. But we have to get them warm slowly and carefully, or you could lose your toes or worse." Julia nodded, tears streaming down her face again. She was so tired of crying, tired of being afraid, tired of pain. But Yates's presence was somehow calming, his competent movements and steady voice making her feel like perhaps she was not going to die on this mountain after all. The old man returned with an armful of blankets and a basin of lukewarm water. Yates took the basin and set it on the floor, testing the temperature with his hand before nodding in satisfaction. He looked up at Julia again, his expression gentle. "I am going to put your feet in this water," he said. "It is going to hurt like hell, but it is necessary. Can you be brave for me?" Julia wanted to laugh at the question. She had been brave all night, had walked through snow with no shoes, had survived being thrown out to die by the man who had promised to love and protect her. What was a little more pain compared to all of that? She nodded, bracing herself. Yates lifted her feet carefully and lowered them into the basin. The water was not even truly warm, but to Julia's frozen feet, it felt like fire. She cried out and tried to pull away, but Yates held her feet firmly in place, his grip gentle but unyielding. "I know," he said, his voice thick with sympathy. "I know it hurts, but you have to keep them in the water. Just breathe through it. Focus on my voice." Julia gripped the arms of the chair so hard that her knuckles turned white, tears pouring down her face as the pain intensified. It felt like thousands of needles were stabbing into her feet simultaneously, like her skin was being flayed from her bones. She heard herself making sounds, gasping and sobbing, but Yates kept talking, his voice steady and calm as he told her she was doing well, that she was brave, that it would get better soon. The old man draped more blankets around her shoulders, and someone pressed a tin cup of something hot into her hands. Julia managed to take a sip and found it was coffee, strong and bitter but warming. She focused on the heat spreading down her throat and into her stomach, on the sound of Yates's voice, on anything except the agony in her feet. Gradually, very gradually, the pain began to shift from acute stabbing sensations to a deep, throbbing ache. Yates carefully examined her feet, his touch gentle as he checked each toe, looking for signs of severe damage. After several long minutes, he looked up at her with something like relief in his eyes. "I think you will be all right," he said. There is some frostbite, but it does not look like you will lose any toes if we take care of them properly. You got lucky." Julia let out a shaky laugh that turned into a sob. Lucky. She supposed she was lucky in a twisted way. Lucky that Yates Morrison had been riding through the mountains during a snowstorm. Lucky that he had seen her. Lucky that he had cared enough to stop. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You saved my life." Yates shook his head, his expression darkening. "What I want to know is who put you in a position where your life needed saving. What were you doing out in the snow with no shoes or coat?" Julia looked away, shame flooding through her. She did not want to tell this stranger about her failed marriage, about her husband's cruelty, about her own foolishness in thinking she could marry a man she barely knew and have it turn out well. But Yates deserved an explanation after what he had done for her. "My husband," she said quietly. "Thomas Zimmerman. He threw me out of our cabin because I helped someone he considered an enemy. He was angry, drunk. He told me I deserved to freeze." The silence that followed was heavy. Julia forced herself to look at Yates and was startled by the fury she saw in his gray eyes. His jaw was clenched tight, and his hands had curled into fists at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "Your husband threw you out into a snowstorm with no shoes or coat and left you to die," Yates repeated, as if he needed to hear the words again to believe them. "What kind of man does that to his wife?" "Not a good one," Julia said, trying for a wry smile but failing. "I should have known better than to marry him. My father had only been dead 2 months when Thomas started courting me. I was grieving and vulnerable, and he was so charming. By the time I realized what he truly was, it was too late." Yates stood abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the snow that was still falling heavily. The old man had retreated to the far side of the room, giving them privacy, but Julia could feel his curious gaze on them. After a long moment, Yates turned back to her. "You cannot go back to him," he said flatly. "If he did this once, he will do it again. Men like that do not change." "I know," Julia said, "but I have nowhere else to go. My father's family lives back east, and they would not take me in after I married against their wishes. Thomas controls all the money my father left me. I have nothing of my own." Yates crossed back to her and knelt down again, his eyes searching her face. "Do you have any friends in Calico?" "Anyone who would shelter you," Julia thought about it. She had not made many friends during her short marriage, as Thomas had discouraged her from socializing without him. But there was Martha Green, the woman who ran the boarding house in town. Martha had always been kind to Julia, and she had no love for Thomas Zimmerman, whose business practices had hurt many of the miners who stayed at her establishment. "There is a woman in town who might help me," Julia said slowly. "Martha Green. She runs a boarding house on 3rd Street. Yates nodded decisively. "Then that is where we will go once this storm clears and you are well enough to travel. You will stay there and we will figure out what to do about your husband." "We," Julia repeated, surprised. "You do not have to involve yourself further. You have already done more than enough." Yates met her eyes, and Julia felt something shift in her chest at the intensity of his gaze. "Any man who would leave a woman to die in the snow deserves to answer for it," he said. "And I am not in the habit of abandoning people who need help. You are under my protection now, Julia Zimmerman, whether you want to be or not." The way he said her name sent a shiver through Julia that had nothing to do with the cold. She studied his face, taking in the determination in his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way he seemed to radiate a quiet strength that made her feel safer than she had felt in months. She barely knew this man, but he had already shown her more kindness and honor than her husband had in 8 months of marriage. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Yates was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. 5 years ago, my sister married a man who turned out to be a monster. He beat her, controlled every aspect of her life, took all her money. By the time the family realized how bad things were, it was too late. He killed her in a drunken rage one night, and by the time we found her, she had been dead for hours. Julia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Yates, I am so sorry." He shook his head, his expression haunted. "I swore after that I would never stand by and let a woman suffer at the hands of a man who was supposed to protect her. When I saw you in the snow, saw what had been done to you, it brought everything back. I will not let you go back to a man who tried to kill you. I will not stand by and do nothing." Julia reached out without thinking and placed her hand over Yates's where it rested on his knee. His hand was warm and calloused, the hand of a man who worked hard for a living. He turned his hand over and gripped hers, and they sat like that for a long moment, connected by shared pain and an understanding that needed no words. The old man cleared his throat from across the room, breaking the spell. "Name is Gus," he said, moving closer. "Been running this way station for near about 15 years now. You folks are welcome to stay as long as you need. Storm like this might last through tomorrow at least." Yates released Julia's hand reluctantly and stood. "We appreciate the hospitality. The lady needs rest, and her feet need to be checked regularly to make sure the frostbite does not worsen." Gus nodded and gestured to the bed in the corner. "She can take the bed. I have got a bedroll I can use, and you look like you could sleep standing up if you had to, young fellow." Julia tried to protest, but Yates was already helping her to her feet, supporting her weight when she wobbled unsteadily. Her feet throbbed with every step, but the pain was manageable now, a dull ache rather than the sharp agony from before. Yates guided her to the bed and helped her sit down, then knelt to examine her feet again in the better light near the bed. "They look better," he said after a careful inspection. "The color is returning, and I do not see any signs of infection yet. We will need to keep them clean and wrapped, and you should stay off them as much as possible for the next few days." Julia nodded, exhaustion suddenly crashing over her like a wave. She had been running on fear and adrenaline for hours, and now that she was finally safe and warm, her body was demanding rest. Yates seemed to sense this because he gently pushed her back onto the pillows and pulled the blankets up over her. "Sleep," he said softly. "I will keep watch." Julia wanted to tell him that he needed to rest too, that he did not have to watch over her, but her eyes were already closing. The last thing she was aware of before sleep claimed her was the feeling of Yates's hand brushing a strand of hair back from her face. The gesture so gentle and tender that it made her heart ache. She dreamed of snow and cold and being chased by shadows with Thomas's face. But every time the shadows got too close, Yates would appear, standing between her and the darkness with his steady gray eyes and quiet strength. She woke several times during the night, startled and afraid, only to find Yates sitting in a chair beside her bed, keeping watch just as he had promised. Each time, he would reach out and touch her hand, his voice low and soothing as he told her she was safe, that he was there, that nothing would hurt her. And each time, Julia would drift back to sleep feeling protected in a way she had never felt before. Morning arrived with weak sunlight filtering through the small window of the way station. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in fresh white snow. Julia woke slowly, her body aching and her feet still throbbing, but feeling more herself than she had the night before. She sat up carefully and found Yates standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. He had taken off his coat and hat, and Julia could see that he was leaner than she had realized, with broad shoulders and narrow hips, his body that of a man who spent his days doing physical work. He turned when he heard her moving, and a smile crossed his face that transformed his serious features into something almost boyish. "You are awake. How are you feeling?" "Sore," Julia admitted. "But better than I expected. How long did you stay up watching over me?" Yates shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. "Gus took a turn around midnight so I could get a few hours of sleep. It was no trouble." Gus appeared from outside, stamping snow off his boots. "Got the horses fed and watered," he announced. "Storm cleared up nice. Roads should be passable by midday if you folks are wanting to head into town." Julia felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. Going to town meant facing the reality of her situation, meant dealing with Thomas and the mess her life had become. But staying here was not an option, and she could not hide forever. She looked at Yates and found him watching her with understanding in his eyes. "We will take it slow," he said. "Get some food in you first, make sure your feet are well enough for travel. There is no rush." Gus produced a simple breakfast of bacon, biscuits, and coffee, and Julia ate ravenously, not realizing until the food was in front of her just how hungry she was. Yates ate more slowly, his eyes constantly returning to her as if checking to make sure she was really all right. When they had finished, he helped her walk around the small room, testing her feet and making sure she could bear weight on them without too much pain. "They are healing well," Yates said with satisfaction. "But you still need proper boots. You cannot ride into town in your stockings." This presented a problem until Gus disappeared into a back room and emerged with a pair of worn but serviceable boots that he claimed had belonged to his late wife. They were a bit large on Julia, but with extra socks, they fit well enough. Yates also insisted she wear his coat, refusing to listen to her protests that he would be cold. "I've got a thick shirt and a vest," he said firmly, "and I have been riding in these mountains for years. You need the coat more than I do." By the time they were ready to leave, it was nearly noon. Julia felt nervous as Yates helped her up onto his horse, settling her in front of him just as he had the night before. She was acutely aware of his closeness, of the solid warmth of his chest against her back, of his arms around her as he held the reins. It was improper, scandalous even, for her to be riding like this with a man who was not her husband. But propriety seemed like a luxury she could not afford at the moment, and besides, being close to Yates made her feel safe in a way that she desperately needed. The ride to Calico took several hours, as the snow had made the roads treacherous, and Yates was careful to keep the horse at a steady but cautious pace. They talked as they rode, Yates telling her about himself and his life. He was a ranch hand, he said, working on a spread about 10 miles outside of town. He had been delivering some papers to a mine foreman when the storm had hit, and he had been on his way back when he found her. "You like the work?" Julia asked, genuinely curious. "Being a ranch hand?" Yates was quiet for a moment, considering. "I do. It is honest work, hard but satisfying. I like working with the horses and cattle, like being outdoors. The pay is not great, but it is enough. I have been saving up, hoping to buy my own small place someday. Nothing fancy, just enough land for a few head of cattle and some horses." Julia could hear the longing in his voice, the dream of something that was his own. She understood that feeling all too well. Her father had owned a successful mercantile business, and Julia had grown up with comfort and security. But after his death, all of that had passed to Thomas through their marriage, and Julia had been left with nothing of her own. "I think you would make a fine ranch owner," Julia said softly. "You have the kind of steadiness and strength that people respect." She felt Yates shift behind her, and when he spoke, his voice was gruff. "That means more coming from you than you might think." They fell into a comfortable silence after that, and Julia found herself relaxing into Yates's embrace, her head resting back against his shoulder. It felt dangerously good to be held like this, to feel protected and cared for. She barely knew this man, had met him less than 24 hours ago, but she already trusted him more than she had ever trusted Thomas. There was something fundamentally decent about Yates Morrison, something honest and true that shone through in every word and action. Calico appeared in the distance, the town sprawling across the desert landscape, with the mountains rising behind it. The contrast between the snow-covered higher elevations and the drier climate of the town was stark, and Julia realized with a start how far she had walked the night before, how close she had come to dying. If Yates had not found her, if he had decided to shelter in place rather than risk the storm, she would be dead now, frozen in the snow with no one to mourn her. "You are thinking dark thoughts," Yates observed. "I can feel you tensing up." Julia let out a shaky breath. "I was just realizing how close I came to dying, if you had not been there." "But I was there," Yates interrupted firmly, "and you are alive and safe. Focus on that." He was right, of course, but it was hard not to dwell on the what-ifs. As they entered the town, Julia felt heads turning to watch them pass. A woman riding with a man who was clearly not her husband, wearing clothes that were obviously borrowed, was bound to cause talk. Julia lifted her chin, refusing to show shame. She had done nothing wrong, and anyone who wanted to judge her could go straight to hell. Martha Green's boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure painted cheerful yellow, with white shutters and a wide front porch. Yates guided his horse up to the hitching post and dismounted, then helped Julia down carefully. Her feet protested the movement, but she managed to stand without crying out. Yates kept a supportive hand on her elbow as they climbed the steps to the porch, and before Julia could knock, the door flew open. Martha Green was a robust woman in her 50s, with graying brown hair pinned up in a practical bun and shrewd hazel eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at Julia's condition, at the borrowed coat and oversized boots and the pale, drawn face, and her expression shifted from surprise to fury to concern in the space of a heartbeat. "Julia Zimmerman," Martha said, her voice tight. "Get yourself inside right now. And you, young man, you come in too. I want to know who is responsible for putting that look on this girl's face." The interior of the boarding house was warm and cozy, decorated with simple but comfortable furniture and smelling of fresh bread and coffee. Martha ushered them into her private sitting room and ordered them to sit while she fetched tea and food. Yates helped Julia into a chair by the fireplace, and she sighed with relief as the warmth began to seep into her bones. When Martha returned with a loaded tray, she set it down and fixed Julia with a stern look. "Now then, tell me everything and do not leave anything out." Julia told the story haltingly, with Yates filling in the parts about finding her in the snow and bringing her to the way station. By the time she finished, Martha's face was red with anger and her hands were clenched into fists in her lap. "That bastard," Martha spat, and Julia was shocked to hear such language from the usually proper woman. "Thomas Zimmerman is a snake and a coward, and he deserves to hang for what he did to you, throwing you out to die in the snow like you were nothing more than trash." "I do not know what to do," Julia admitted, tears welling up again. "I have no money, nowhere to go. He controls everything my father left me." Martha leaned forward and took Julia's hands in hers. "First things first. You are staying here in this house for as long as you need. I have got a spare room on the second floor that is yours. Second, we are going to see the sheriff and report what Thomas did. What he did was attempted murder, plain and simple." "The sheriff is in Thomas's pocket," Yates said quietly. "Half the law in this town is, Thomas has money and influence and Julia is his wife. The law will see it as a domestic matter and refuse to get involved." Martha scowled but nodded reluctantly. You are probably right, but that does not mean we cannot build a case against him. Julia, did anyone else know about the trouble between you and Thomas? Were there witnesses to his violence? Julia shook her head miserably. He was always careful to hurt me where it would not show, and most of our arguments happened in private at the cabin. What about the man you helped escape? Yates asked. This James Garrett. He knew about Thomas's illegal activities. If we could find him, get him to testify. He was heading to Sacramento, Julia said, hope flickering in her chest. He said he was going to bring the evidence to the federal marshals there since the local law could not be trusted. Martha and Yates exchanged looks, and Julia could see them thinking, planning. She felt a surge of gratitude for these two people who were ready to fight for her, to stand by her side against a powerful man who had tried to kill her. I can ride to Sacramento, Yates said. Find this James Garrett and see if the marshals are taking action. If they are, that could change everything. That is a week's journey at least, Martha protested. And what if Zimmerman comes looking for Julia while you are gone? I will make sure she is protected, Yates said, his jaw set. I will talk to some of the ranch hands I know, men who are good in a fight and who have no love for Zimmerman. They will keep watch over the boarding house. Julia listened to them make plans, feeling overwhelmed and grateful and terrified all at once. She looked at Yates, at the determined set of his shoulders and the fire in his gray eyes, and felt something warm unfurl in her chest. This man, who had known her for less than a day, was willing to ride across the territory to help her. He was willing to risk making an enemy of one of the most powerful men in the region, and he was doing it not for money or reward, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Yates, Julia said softly, interrupting the planning. Both Yates and Martha turned to look at her. Thank you. For everything. I do not know how I will ever repay you. Yates crossed to her and knelt down, taking her hands in his much larger ones. You do not owe me anything, Julia. I am doing this because I want to, because you deserve better than what you have been given. You are brave and strong, and you deserve to be free of that man. Julia felt tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were not tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something else that she was not quite ready to name. She squeezed Yates's hands, holding on to the lifeline he represented. The next few days passed in a blur of activity and anxiety. True to his word, Yates arranged for several ranch hands to keep watch over the boarding house, men with hard eyes and ready guns who made it clear that anyone threatening Julia would have to go through them first. Martha made sure Julia had everything she needed, from proper clothing to medicine for her healing feet to simple comfort and companionship. Thomas made no appearance, which surprised Julia until Martha explained that word had spread through town about what he had done. Public opinion, it seemed, was not on Thomas's side, and several of his business associates had quietly distanced themselves from him. It was not enough to ruin him, but it was enough to make him cautious about his next moves. Yates prepared for his journey to Sacramento, and Julia found herself spending more and more time with him, helping him gather supplies and plan his route. They talked for hours, sharing stories about their lives and their hopes for the future. Julia learned that Yates had grown up on a small farm in Missouri, that he had come west after his sister's death, because staying in his hometown had been too painful. He was 26, just 5 years older than Julia, and he had a quiet sense of humor that would emerge unexpectedly, making her laugh in spite of everything. For his part, Yates seemed fascinated by Julia, asking her about her childhood, her father, her dreams. She told him about growing up in the mercantile, about learning the business at her father's knee, about her love of books and learning. She told him about her mother, who had died when Julia was only 10, and about how she and her father had been a team, running the business together and taking care of each other. He would have hated Thomas, Julia said one evening as she and Yates sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sun set over the mountains. My father was a good judge of character, and he would have seen right through Thomas's charm to the monster underneath. I think that is why I ignored all the warning signs. I was so lost without my father that I convinced myself Thomas could fill that void. But no one could replace my father, and trying to find that in a husband was foolish. Yates was quiet for a moment, then said, "You are not foolish. You were grieving and vulnerable, and Thomas took advantage of that. The fault is his, not yours." Julia turned to look at him, at his profile silhouetted against the fading light. "You are a good man, Yates Morrison, better than I deserve." Yates turned to face her, his gray eyes intense. "You deserve everything good in this world, Julia Zimmerman. Do not ever think otherwise." The moment stretched between them, charged with something electric and frightening and wonderful all at once. Julia felt her breath catch in her throat as Yates reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek. She leaned into the touch, closing her eyes, and felt Yates lean closer. The sound of footsteps on the porch broke the spell, and they jerked apart as Martha emerged from the house, carrying a tray with coffee and cake. If she noticed the tension between them, she did not comment, merely setting the tray down and pouring them each a cup with her usual brisk efficiency. "Yates, you should get some rest," Martha said firmly. "You are leaving at dawn, and you will need your strength for the journey ahead." Yates nodded and stood, draining his coffee in one long swallow. He looked down at Julia, and she saw a promise in his eyes that made her heart race. "I will find James Garrett," he said, "and I will bring back help. Just hold on a little longer." "Be safe," Julia whispered. "Please be safe." Yates smiled, that boyish grin that transformed his face. "Always am." But as Julia watched him walk away into the gathering darkness, she felt a chill of premonition that had nothing to do with the evening air. The world was a dangerous place, and the road to Sacramento was long and treacherous. She sent up a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening, begging them to keep Yates safe and bring him back to her. That night, Julia lay awake in her small room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the cowboy who had saved her life. She barely knew him, had known him for only a handful of days, but he had already become important to her in a way that she could not quite explain. With Thomas, everything had been fast and superficial, a whirlwind courtship that had swept her off her feet and left her dizzy and confused. With Yates, it was different, slower, deeper, more real. She trusted him in a way she had never trusted Thomas, felt safe with him in a way she had never felt safe before. And somewhere in the midst of all the fear and chaos and uncertainty, Julia realized with a start that she was falling in love with him. The thought terrified her. She was still married, still legally bound to Thomas, even though she never wanted to see him again. She had no right to these feelings, no right to imagine a future with Yates when her present was such a tangled mess. But her heart did not seem to care about logic or propriety or the law. Her heart only knew that Yates Morrison had carried her through the snow, had kept watch over her through the night, had promised to fight for her when she could not fight for herself. And that was enough to make her love him, foolish and impossible as it might be. Dawn came too quickly, and Julia dressed hurriedly and rushed downstairs to find Yates already in the kitchen, accepting a package of food from Martha for his journey. He looked up when Julia entered, and his face softened into a smile that made her insides melt. "I was hoping to see you before I left," he said. Julia crossed to him, not caring that Martha was watching with knowing eyes. I could not let you leave without saying goodbye." "It is not goodbye," Yates said firmly. "It is just see you soon. I will be back before you know it, and I will have help with me." Julia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Yates reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Take care of yourself. Listen to Martha. Stay inside as much as possible and do not go anywhere alone. Those ranch hands will keep you safe, but you need to be smart." "I will," Julia promised. "You take care of yourself too. Do not take any unnecessary risks." Yates grinned. "Me, I am always careful." Martha snorted from her position by the stove, and even Julia had to smile. They all knew that Yates was about to ride into what could be considerable danger, chasing down a man who had evidence against a powerful criminal, and trying to bring federal law into a situation that was already volatile. But Yates seemed unconcerned, his confidence unshakable. He released Julia's hand reluctantly and headed for the door, pausing on the threshold to look back at her one more time. "I will be back," he said, his voice full of promise. "Wait for me." "I will," Julia whispered, and then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Martha came up beside Julia and put a comforting arm around her shoulders. "That is a good man," she said quietly, "the kind you do not find every day." "I know," Julia said, her voice thick with emotion. "I just hope I get the chance to tell him that." The days that followed were some of the longest of Julia's life. She helped Martha around the boarding house, cooking and cleaning and tending to the guests who came and went. It kept her hands busy, but her mind was always on Yates, wondering where he was, if he was safe, if he had found James Garrett. The ranch hands kept their vigil, and true to Yates's word, they made sure Julia was never without protection. Thomas made one attempt to approach the boarding house, arriving in his fancy carriage with 2 hired thugs at his side. But the ranch hands made it clear that he was not welcome, and after a tense standoff that had half the town watching from windows and doorways, Thomas retreated. Julia watched from her upstairs window, her heart pounding, and felt a fierce satisfaction when she saw the humiliation on her husband's face. Martha reported later that Thomas was claiming Julia had run off with another man, that she had abandoned her marriage vows and was living in sin. The gossip flew through town like wildfire, but to Julia's surprise, most people seemed to side with her. Too many people had experienced Thomas's ruthlessness in business, had seen the kind of man he really was. And the story of how he had thrown his wife out into a snowstorm to die had shocked even his staunchest supporters. "Public opinion is a powerful thing," Martha said with satisfaction. "Thomas is learning that money and influence only go so far when people think you are a monster." A week passed, then 10 days, then 2 weeks. Julia tried not to worry, tried to tell herself that Sacramento was far away and that Yates was probably just taking his time to make sure everything was handled properly. But every day that passed without word made her anxiety grow. She caught herself watching the road constantly, jumping at every sound of horses approaching. It was on the 16th day after Yates's departure that Julia saw riders approaching the boarding house. Her heart leaped into her throat and she rushed downstairs, ignoring Martha's calls to wait. She burst out onto the porch and felt relief wash over her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. Yates was back, sitting tall in his saddle, looking dusty and tired but gloriously alive. And riding with him were 3 men in federal marshal badges, their faces serious and determined. Behind them was James Garrett, the prospector Julia had helped escape, looking nervous but resolute. Yates dismounted and was at Julia's side in 3 long strides, catching her as she swayed. "I told you I would come back," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Julia threw her arms around his neck, not caring who was watching or what anyone thought. "I was so worried," she said into his shoulder. "You were gone so long." "I am sorry," Yates said, his arms coming around her waist and holding her tight. But it took time to convince the marshals to act, to gather all the evidence. It had to be done right. One of the marshals cleared his throat, and Julia reluctantly pulled back from Yates, though he kept one arm around her waist as if reluctant to let her go completely. The marshal was a stern-looking man in his 40s, with iron-gray hair and sharp blue eyes. "Mrs. Zimmerman," he said, tipping his hat. "I am Marshal Clayton Reed. We have been investigating your husband's illegal mining operations, and we have enough evidence now to arrest him. But we need your testimony about what he did to you. Attempted murder is a serious charge, and with your statement, we can make sure he never has the chance to hurt you or anyone else again." Julia felt a surge of hope so strong it made her dizzy. "I will tell you everything," she said. "Anything you need to know." The marshals came inside, and over the next several hours Julia gave her testimony, recounting in painful detail the abuse she had suffered, the illegal activities she had witnessed, and the night Thomas had thrown her out into the snow to die. Yates sat beside her the entire time, holding her hand and lending her his strength when the memories became too difficult. When Julia finished, Marshal Reed nodded with satisfaction. "That is more than enough." Combined with Mr. Garrett's evidence of the illegal mining operations and the testimony from several miners who were cheated, we have a solid case. Thomas Zimmerman will be arrested today, and he will stand trial for his crimes. True to his word, Marshal Reed and his deputies rode out within the hour to arrest Thomas. Yates stayed with Julia, and they sat together on the porch, not speaking, just being together. When the marshals returned with Thomas in handcuffs, Julia felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had not realized she was carrying. Thomas looked haggard and furious, his clothes rumpled and his eyes wild. When he saw Julia standing on the porch with Yates's arm around her shoulders, his face contorted with rage. "You whore," he screamed at her. "You will pay for this. You are my wife and you belong to me." "She does not belong to anyone," Yates said coldly, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "And after what you did to her, you are lucky I did not kill you myself." Thomas lunged toward them, but the marshals held him back, dragging him toward the jail. His curses and threats echoed through the street until they faded into the distance. Julia turned her face into Yates's shoulder and breathed deeply, letting the reality of her freedom sink in. "It is over," Yates said softly, his lips against her hair. "He cannot hurt you anymore." The trial took place 3 weeks later, and it was the talk of the entire territory. Thomas Zimmerman, once one of the most powerful men in the region, was brought low by the testimony of his wife, the miners he had cheated, and the evidence of his illegal activities. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, and all his assets were seized to compensate his victims. For Julia, the most important outcome was that her marriage was annulled on the grounds of fraud and abuse. The judge, a stern man who made it clear he had no patience for men who harmed women, ruled that the marriage had never been valid since Thomas had entered into it under false pretenses, intending only to steal Julia's inheritance. Julia's father's estate was returned to her, giving her financial independence for the first time in her adult life. Through it all, Yates was there. He attended the trial every day, sitting in the front row where Julia could see him and draw strength from his presence. He helped her deal with the lawyers and the paperwork, making sure she understood everything and that her interests were protected. And in the quiet moments, he was simply there, offering comfort and companionship, and the kind of steady, reliable presence that Julia had come to depend on. As winter turned to spring and the snow melted from the mountains, Julia found herself thinking about the future for the first time in months. She was free now, truly free, with no husband to control her and no one to answer to but herself. She could do anything, go anywhere. The world was open to her, in a way it had not been since her father's death. But the only place she wanted to be was wherever Yates Morrison was. They had not spoken of their feelings, had not acknowledged the growing attraction between them beyond lingering looks and accidental touches. Julia told herself it was too soon, that she needed time to heal from the trauma of her marriage before she could think about loving someone else. But her heart had other ideas, and every day that passed only made her more certain that what she felt for Yates was real and true and worth fighting for. It was Martha who finally forced the issue, cornering Julia one afternoon in the kitchen of the boarding house. "That man is in love with you," she said bluntly, in her usual forthright manner. "And unless I am completely blind, you feel the same way about him. So what are you waiting for?" Julia felt her cheeks heat. "It is too soon. I have only been free of Thomas for a few weeks. What will people think?" Martha waved a dismissive hand. "People will think whatever they want to think regardless of what you do. The question is, are you going to let fear and propriety keep you from happiness? Because I can tell you from experience, life is too short and happiness is too rare to waste." Julia thought about Martha's words long into the night. She knew the older woman was right, knew that she was using propriety and timing as excuses to protect her heart. The truth was, she was terrified. She had been wrong about Thomas, had trusted the wrong man and paid dearly for it. How could she be sure she was not making the same mistake with Yates? But even as the thought formed, she knew it was foolish. Yates had proven himself time and time again. He had saved her life, had fought for her, had stood by her through the darkest time of her life expecting nothing in return. He was nothing like Thomas, and deep down, Julia knew that. She was just afraid of being hurt again, afraid of being vulnerable. The next morning, Julia made a decision. She would tell Yates how she felt, and whatever happened after that would happen. She was tired of being afraid, tired of letting her past dictate her future. She deserved happiness, and if Yates could give her that, she was going to reach for it with both hands. She found Yates in the stable behind the boarding house, tending to his horse. He looked up when she entered, and his face broke into that smile that never failed to make her heart skip a beat. "Julia," he said, wiping his hands on his pants, "is everything all right?" "I need to talk to you," Julia said, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "About us." Yates went very still, his gray eyes searching her face. "All right," he said carefully. "What about us?" Julia took a deep breath and plunged ahead. "I know it has not been very long since the annulment, and I know people will talk. But I need you to know that I have feelings for you, Yates. Strong feelings. You have been so good to me, so kind and patient and brave, and somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you. And I know that might complicate things, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I needed to tell you because I cannot keep it inside anymore." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Julia held her breath, watching Yates's face for any reaction. He was staring at her with an expression she could not quite read, his jaw clenched and his hands curled into fists at his sides. Then, suddenly, he moved. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms, his mouth coming down on hers in a kiss that was hungry and desperate and full of months of pent-up longing. Julia gasped against his lips and then melted into him, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck as she kissed him back with everything she had. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I have been in love with you since the moment I found you in the snow," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I tried to keep my distance, tried to give you space to heal, but it has been killing me. Every day I wanted to tell you how I felt, wanted to kiss you, wanted to hold you and never let you go." Julia laughed, the sound shaky with tears and joy. "Why did we waste so much time?" "Because we are both stubborn and scared," Yates said with a rueful smile. "But no more. I love you, Julia Zimmerman, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you what real love looks like. Will you let me?" Julia answered by kissing him again, pouring all her love and hope and joy into the embrace. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling like fools, and Julia felt lighter than she had in years. They spent the rest of the day together, walking through town and talking about the future. Yates told her about his dream of buying a small ranch, and Julia surprised him by offering to use part of her inheritance to help make that dream a reality. "We could be partners," she said, her eyes shining with excitement. "I know about business from my father, and you know about ranching. Together, we could build something wonderful." Yates looked at her with such love and admiration that it took her breath away. "Partners," he agreed, "in everything." They were married 2 months later in a simple ceremony at Martha's boarding house, with Martha and James Garrett standing as witnesses. Julia wore a simple blue dress and carried wildflowers, and Yates wore his best shirt and a tie that Martha had insisted he borrow. It was nothing like the elaborate wedding Julia had had with Thomas, and that was exactly what made it perfect. This was real, true, a joining of two people who genuinely loved each other and wanted to build a life together. Their wedding night was spent in a small room at the boarding house, and it was everything Julia had hoped it would be. Yates was gentle and patient, taking his time to make sure Julia felt safe and cherished. He whispered words of love against her skin, his hands and mouth worshiping her body in a way that Thomas never had. And when they finally came together, Julia felt a completeness that she had never experienced before, a sense of being exactly where she belonged. In the months that followed, Julia and Yates worked tirelessly to build their ranch. They found a beautiful piece of land about 15 miles outside Calico, with good grazing and a creek that ran year-round. They built a modest house together, side by side, and Julia found that she loved the physical work, loved seeing the results of their labor take shape before her eyes. They started with a small herd of cattle and a few horses, and slowly built up their operation. Julia kept the books and handled the business side of things, using the skills her father had taught her to make smart decisions about buying and selling. Yates managed the day-to-day operations of the ranch, working from dawn to dusk to make sure the animals were healthy and the property was maintained. It was hard work, but it was satisfying in a way that Julia had never experienced. She was building something with the man she loved, creating a life that was entirely their own. And every night, when they fell into bed exhausted but happy, Yates would pull her close and tell her he loved her, and Julia would know that she had finally found what she had been searching for all along. Their first child, a son they named Matthew, was born in the spring of 1885, just over a year after their wedding. Julia labored for 12 hours with Martha and a midwife in attendance, and when she finally held her son in her arms, she cried tears of joy and relief. Yates was beside himself with happiness, cradling the tiny infant with a gentleness that made Julia fall in love with him all over again. "He is perfect," Yates whispered, his eyes shining with tears. "You are perfect. I am the luckiest man alive." Julia reached up and cupped his cheek with her free hand. "We are lucky," she corrected. "All three of us." They raised Matthew with all the love and attention they could give, teaching him about the ranch and the land, about honor and hard work and kindness. 2 years later, they had a daughter named Sarah, and then another son named Daniel, 2 years after that. Their house was filled with noise and laughter and love, and Julia often found herself pausing in the middle of her chores to simply look around and marvel at the life she had built. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, and she and Yates sat on the porch watching the sunset, Julia would think back to that terrible night in the snow. She would remember the cold and the fear and the certainty that she was going to die. And then she would look at Yates, at the man who had saved her life and given her a reason to keep living, and she would feel overwhelming gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought them together. "What are you thinking about?" Yates would ask, reaching over to take her hand. "About how lucky I am," Julia would say. "About how that worst night of my life led to the best thing that ever happened to me." Yates would smile and pull her close, kissing her temple. "I am the lucky one. You gave me everything I ever wanted. A home, a family, a purpose. You gave me love." "We gave those things to each other," Julia would correct, and Yates would nod because it was true. They were partners in every sense of the word, equals building a life together. Years passed and the ranch prospered. They added more land, more cattle, more horses. They hired ranch hands to help with the work, and Julia found herself becoming something of a businesswoman in the community, known for her sharp mind and fair dealings. Yates became respected as one of the best ranchers in the region, his reputation for honesty and quality spreading far and wide. Their children grew up strong and healthy, learning the value of hard work and family. Matthew showed an aptitude for ranching and announced at 16 that he wanted to stay on the land and eventually take over the operation. Sarah was more interested in books and learning, and Julia and Yates supported her dream of becoming a teacher. Daniel, the youngest, had a gift with horses that reminded Julia of his father, and he spent every spare moment in the stable. Through it all, Julia and Yates remained deeply in love. They had their disagreements, as any couple did, but they always talked through their problems and never went to bed angry. They made a point of taking time for just the two of them, stealing moments alone whenever they could to remember why they had fallen in love in the first place. One evening in the summer of 1895, 11 years after that fateful night in the snow, Julia and Yates rode up to their favorite spot on the ranch, a high ridge that overlooked the entire valley. They had packed a simple meal and a blanket, and they sat together watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. "You ever regret it?" Julia asked suddenly. "Stopping to help me that night? Your life would have been simpler if you had just ridden past." Yates looked at her like she had lost her mind. "Regret it? Julia, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. I would make the same choice 1,000 times over. You gave me everything." Julia smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "You gave me everything too. You gave me my life back. You gave me love and family and a future. You showed me what it means to be truly happy." Yates wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. "We have built something good here, have we not? Something worth all the hardship and the struggles." "We have," Julia agreed. "We have built a life worth living." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky. Julia thought about the twists and turns that had brought her to this moment, the pain and fear and struggle that had ultimately led to joy and love and fulfillment. She thought about Thomas, rotting in prison, and felt no anger or bitterness, only pity for a man who had never understood what real love and partnership meant. "I love you," Julia said softly, "more than I can ever express in words." "I love you too," Yates replied, kissing the top of her head. "For the rest of my days and beyond." They rode back to the ranch as the moon rose, lighting their way home. The house was warm and welcoming when they arrived, filled with the sounds of their children and the smell of dinner cooking. Julia paused in the doorway, taking in the scene before her, committing it to memory. This was her life now. Not the cold and fear and pain of that night in the snow, but this warmth and love and belonging. She had been lost, had nearly died in the darkness, but Yates Morrison had found her and carried her into the light. He had given her a second chance at life, and she had taken it and built something beautiful with it. As the years continued to pass, Julia and Yates grew older together, their love deepening with each season. They became grandparents, watching with joy as Matthew married a sweet girl from town and started his own family. Sarah became a teacher, just as she had dreamed, and married a banker who adored her. Daniel started a horse breeding operation that quickly gained a reputation for quality throughout the territory. Julia and Yates eventually stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the ranch, letting Matthew take over while they enjoyed a slower pace of life. They spent their days working in the garden Julia had always wanted, taking long rides through the countryside, and spoiling their grandchildren shamelessly. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised Julia with a trip back to the place where he had found her that snowy night. It was summer now, and the landscape looked completely different, green and warm instead of white and deadly. They stood together on the spot where Yates had first lifted Julia into his arms, and Julia felt tears streaming down her face. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, though she thought she knew. Yates took both her hands in his and looked into her eyes with all the love and devotion of 2 decades of marriage. "Because this is where our life together truly began. This is where I knew that I would do anything to save you, to protect you, to make you mine. I wanted to stand here with you and remember how far we have come, how much we have overcome. And I wanted to tell you that I would do it all again in a heartbeat." Julia threw her arms around his neck and kissed him with all the passion and love she felt. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. "You are the love of my life," Julia said. "The man who saved me in every way a person can be saved. I am so grateful that you found me that night, that you stopped, that you cared." "I am grateful too," Yates said, "for all of it, the good and the bad, the easy and the hard, because it all led to you, to us, to this life we have built together." They stayed on the mountain until sunset, talking and remembering and simply being together. When they finally rode home, the stars were shining bright overhead, and Julia felt a deep sense of peace and contentment. She had faced darkness and come through to the light. She had known fear and found courage. She had been broken and been made whole again by the love of a good man. As they settled into bed that night, Yates pulled Julia close, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. It was the same heartbeat she had heard that first night when he had carried her through the snow, the same heartbeat that had soothed her fears and given her hope when she had none. It was the heartbeat of the man she loved more than life itself, the man who had shown her that true love was about sacrifice and partnership and choosing each other every single day. "Thank you," Julia whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Yates asked sleepily. "For carrying me," Julia said. "Not just that night in the snow, but every day since. For carrying me through the hard times, for sharing the good times, for being my partner and my love and my home." Yates tightened his arms around her. "It has been my honor and my privilege," he said. "Today, tomorrow, and always." Julia closed her eyes and let herself drift off to sleep, safe and warm in the arms of the man who had saved her life and given her a future worth living. She had walked through snow barefoot, had faced death and despair, but Yates Morrison had carried her the rest of the way. And together, they had built something beautiful and lasting and true. Their story became something of a legend in Calico and the surrounding area, the tale of the cowboy who had saved a woman from freezing to death and ended up falling in love with her. People would ask Julia about it sometimes, curious about the details, and she would smile and tell them that yes, it was true, every word of it. And she would look at Yates with all the love in her heart, and everyone who saw them together knew that they were witnessing something rare and precious. As they grew old together, their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by years of shared experiences and deepened by the knowledge that they had chosen each other against all odds. They faced challenges and heartaches, as all couples do, but they faced them together, always presenting a united front to the world. When Yates turned 60, a kick from a startled horse left him with a broken leg that never quite healed properly, giving him a slight limp for the rest of his life. Julia nursed him through the recovery with patience and devotion, and Yates joked that now she got to carry him for a change. When Julia fell ill with pneumonia at 62, Yates barely left her side for 3 weeks, sitting by her bed and reading to her and holding her hand through the worst of it. They celebrated their 30th anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The ranch was thriving under Matthew's management, and the family had become one of the most respected in the region. Julia and Yates stood together at the party thrown in their honor, accepting congratulations and good wishes from friends and neighbors, and Julia felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life they had built. 30 years, she said to Yates as they danced together that evening, moving slowly to accommodate his bad leg. "Can you believe it? Feels like yesterday and forever all at once," Yates replied, pulling her closer. "And I would not change a single moment of it, not even the hard times." Julia asked with a smile. "Especially not the hard times," Yates said seriously. "Because those are the moments that made us stronger, that proved we could weather any storm as long as we had each other." Julia rested her head on his shoulder and let the music carry them, surrounded by the people they loved in the home they had built together. She thought about that young woman who had walked through the snow barefoot, frightened and alone and certain she was going to die. She thought about the cowboy who had found her and carried her to safety, not knowing that he was carrying her straight into a future neither of them could have imagined. "I love you," Julia whispered, the words as true and heartfelt as they had been the first time she had said them 30 years before. "I love you too," Yates replied, the words a promise and a prayer and a declaration all at once, always and forever. And as they continued to dance under the stars, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built, Julia knew with absolute certainty that she had found her happy ending. It had not come easily, and it had not come without pain and struggle, but it had come. And it was more beautiful and precious than anything she could have dreamed. The years continued to pass, and Julia and Yates grew old together with grace and dignity. They remained active in the community, known for their generosity and their willingness to help anyone in need. Julia, remembering her own desperate circumstances, became a champion for women in difficult situations, helping to establish a shelter in Calico for women fleeing abusive marriages. Yates worked alongside her, using his reputation and influence to advocate for stronger laws protecting women and children. Their legacy extended far beyond their ranch and their family. They had touched countless lives through their kindness, and their example of what a true partnership should look like. Young couples would come to them for advice, and Julia and Yates would welcome them into their home and share the wisdom they had gained through decades of marriage. "It is about choice," Yates would tell them. "Every day you have to choose to love each other, to put each other first, to work through the problems instead of running from them. And it is about respect," Julia would add. "About seeing your partner as an equal, as someone whose thoughts and feelings and dreams matter just as much as your own." They would look at each other as they spoke, their eyes meeting with the understanding that came from years of shared life. And the young couples would leave inspired and hopeful, determined to build relationships as strong and lasting as what Julia and Yates had created. On a crisp autumn day in 1910, just after their 36th wedding anniversary, Yates and Julia took one last ride up to their favorite spot on the ridge. Yates's health had been declining, his heart growing weaker with each passing month, and they both knew that their time together was drawing to a close. But neither of them spoke of it as they sat together watching the sunset, content to simply be in each other's presence. "It has been a good life," Yates said quietly, his hand gripping Julia's with a strength that belied his failing health. "Better than I ever dared hope for." "The best life," Julia agreed, tears streaming down her weathered face, "because I got to share it with you." Yates turned to look at her, his gray eyes still as intense and full of love as they had been that first day. "Promise me something," he said. "Anything," Julia whispered. "Promise me you will keep living," Yates said. "After I am gone, promise me you will not give up. You have so much more to give to this world, so much love to share. Promise me you will keep going." Julia wanted to protest, wanted to tell him that she could not imagine life without him, but she saw the pleading in his eyes and knew that this was important to him. So she nodded and made the promise, even though her heart was breaking at the thought of keeping it. "I promise," she said, "but you have to promise me something too." "What is that?" Yates asked. "Promise me that wherever you go, you will wait for me," Julia said. "Promise me that when my time comes, you will be there to carry me one more time." Yates smiled through his own tears and pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I promise. I will always be there when you need me in this life and the next." They stayed on the ridge until the stars came out, holding each other and remembering all the moments that had made up their life together. When they finally rode home, both of them knew it would be the last time they would make that journey together. Yates passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks later, with Julia holding his hand and their children gathered around his bed. His last words were, "I love you," spoken to Julia with his dying breath, and Julia held him and cried and thanked him for the beautiful life he had given her. The grief was overwhelming at first, a crushing weight that made it hard for Julia to breathe. But she remembered her promise to Yates, and slowly, day by day, she began to find her way forward. She threw herself into the work at the women's shelter, into spending time with her children and grandchildren, into all the things that gave her life meaning and purpose. And in the quiet moments, she would talk to Yates as if he were still there, telling him about her day and sharing her thoughts and feelings. She wore his wedding ring on a chain around her neck, close to her heart, and took comfort in the knowledge that he was waiting for her, just as he had promised. Julia lived for another 8 years after Yates passed, years filled with love and family and continued service to her community. She saw the women's shelter grow and thrive, helping dozens of women escape dangerous situations and build new lives. She watched her grandchildren grow up and have children of their own, filling the ranch with yet another generation of laughter and love. On a cool spring morning in 1918, Julia woke up feeling different, feeling like something inside her had shifted. She was 84 years old, and her body was tired and worn from a long life well lived. She got dressed slowly and walked out onto the porch of the ranch house, looking out over the land she and Yates had built together. Matthew found her there an hour later, sitting peacefully in her rocking chair with a smile on her face. She had passed quietly and without pain, slipping away as gently as a leaf falling from a tree. And in her hand, clutched close to her heart, was the wedding ring Yates had given her 54 years before. The family buried her next to Yates on the hill overlooking the ranch, under a large oak tree that had been their favorite spot for picnics when the children were young. The headstone reads simply, "Julia Morrison, beloved wife, mother, and friend. She walked through darkness and found light." But those who had known Julia and Yates knew that there was more to the story than what was written on stone. They knew about the night in the snow, about the cowboy who had saved a woman's life and ended up falling in love with her. They knew about the partnership that had built a legacy, the love that had endured through decades of joy and hardship, the promise of forever that had been kept until the very end. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the valley and the stars shone bright overhead, people swore they could see two figures riding together on the ridge, a man and a woman who had found each other against all odds and had refused to let anything, not even death, separate them. Their love story became woven into the fabric of the community, passed down through generations as an example of what true love looked like. Children would hear the tale and dream of finding that kind of connection, that kind of partnership. Adults would remember it during their own hard times and take comfort in knowing that love could triumph over even the darkest circumstances. The ranch continued to thrive under the management of Julia and Yates's descendants, a living testament to what they had built together. The women's shelter Julia had helped establish still operated, now named the Julia Morrison House in her honor. And every year on the anniversary of that fateful night in the snow, the family would gather on the mountain pass where Yates had found Julia and tell the story again, keeping the memory alive for yet another generation. It was a story of survival and salvation, of courage and compassion, of two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and had chosen to build something beautiful together. It was a reminder that love could be found in the darkest moments, that kindness could change the course of a life, and that true partnership meant carrying each other through whatever storms life brought. And somewhere, beyond the veil of mortality, Julia and Yates were together again, their love as strong and true as it had been that first moment when he had lifted her into his arms and promised to keep her safe. They had walked a long road together, through snow and sun, through hardship and joy, through all the moments that made up a life well lived. And now, finally, they could rest, secure in the knowledge that their love had made a difference, that their story would live on, that they had created something that would endure long after they were gone. It was a happy ending, as all the best love stories are. Not perfect, because life is never perfect, but real and true and full of the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. Julia had been forced to walk through snow barefoot, had faced death and despair, but Yates had carried her the rest of the way. And together, they had created a legacy of love that would never be forgotten.